for making such effort to enlightenment, this is the practice of bodhisattvas. For all who want to train on the bodhisattva path, I have written the 37 practices of bodhisattvas, following what has been said by the excellent ones on the meaning of the sutras, tantras, and treatises. Though not poetically pleasing to scholars, owing to my poor intelligence and lack of learning, I've relied on the sutras and the words of the excellent, so I think these bodhisattva practices are without error. However, as the great deeds of bodhisattvas are hard to fathom for one of my poor intelligence, I beg the excellent to forgive all faults, such as contradictions and non sequiturs. Through the virtue from this, may all living beings gain the ultimate conventional altruistic intention, and thereby become like the protector Chenrezig, who dwells in neither extreme, not in the world nor in peace. Good morning, everyone. No need to apologize. Sometimes I think, at least based on my own history and experience, I think the children get more out of this than certainly than I did than the adults. Because I think, us as Westerners, we obviously have our own conditioning. We've been born in a certain way. We have all sorts of, uh, you know, baggage, and not necessarily in a bad way. Makes me think, though, I had one friend who was Polish. She somehow got herself out of Poland before the Iron Curtain came up, and somehow made it to the Rochester Zen Center. She's a very strong practitioner. Um, she told me once, for instance, she did a pilgrimage to Japan, and she was at Daitokuji, one of the great Zen monasteries. And when all this started with Tibetan Buddhism in Rochester, she came by one day and just to our shrine, and she a week later called me and said, I have to tell you that I had the same feeling in front of your shrine that I had at Daitokuji. So this is the power of, like, pure transmission. And pure transmission doesn't mean that we're all pure. it means that there's sincerity there. So anyway, she always had this statement. She always talked about, she would sort of bitch and moan sometimes about the frustration she was having with fellow practitioners. She'd say, they have so much luggage. So anyway, all of us have a lot of luggage. But I often think of the children that they don't. I mean, they're born with it too, of course, but before it's developed like us. I often thought of my own daughters, if they were here, even little Dahlia, they smell the incense, they hear the bell, they're having this direct experiential thing without this immediate barrier of all our assumptions, all of our concepts, all of our beliefs that we cling to. And in our clinging, we create our identity. This is why it's so difficult, because when there's something in the Dharma that seems to contradict something, it's not just like a conceptual difference. That's not so much. People who can be objective conceptually, they can play with, but for most of us, we take our concepts and then we cling to them as being part of our identity. And so it's at a deeper level, it's like at a personal attack. You see so much of this on social media, of course, and larger general politics is like that too. You're attacking people's identity. That's why people can't agree on anything, because it's unexamined, but very deeply threatening, which is something which actually might not be threatening, but nonetheless. So I always felt happy for Gretchen and my daughters, because at this time too, we didn't have facility, and like Lama Tarchin and Gara Rinpoche would come to town. They would stay at our house. And I just thought, they were having experience with these people without these ideas of what's a Lama, even. What's a Lama supposed to be? How is the Dalai Lama different from the Pope? All these kind of questions that we have. And there's nothing wrong with having those questions. But I think for my daughters, they didn't. I remember once we had a visiting Lama staying we were at the dining room table, and the girls were done eating, and they were just doing what little kids do, little kids, and they were walking through and walking around. It was kind of a circular kind of arrangement in the house. And Megan walked by, and this llama who had just met her just went, peaceful. And then a couple of seconds later, Tracy walked by and she said, wrathful. But I think their experience is just these loving, sincere, not phony loving um, people who are interested in their education and just, what can I say? What human beings are supposed to be. And so that's a great advantage. So that's why we've always had here at White Lotus, bring the kids in, make some noise, not a problem. The adults can learn to increase their concentration. We had another story for you. Sorry, when we took the children out and ourselves to Lama Tarchin was having a retreat. One of his first large retreats was out Mount Baldy Zen Center in the San Gabriel Mountains outside of Los Angeles. And this was a Zen center by Sasaki Roshi, who was a very disciplined, they're all disciplined, but had a particularly severe kind of Japanese aesthetic to the place. But nonetheless, Lama Tarchin, I got out there early and I saw him drive in with a U-Haul truck that was like full of stuff, Tonkas, heavy metal, all these things. And this was kind of a shock to me because Gretchen and I, having practiced Zen Buddhism, you have a robe and a bowl. You didn't even have a bowl. We didn't have a robe either, a cushion. That was it. So at the Zen Center, for instance, at Mount Baldy, everything in their shrine room, they just had a very simple shrine with a little tiny Manjushri statue there, like one flower and one stick of incense. So Lama Tarchin comes in and we take over this shrine, right? Suddenly it's got all these tankas and statues and all this stuff. Sasaki Roshi was gone. It was their off period, but he left 2 American monks there as caretakers. And after Lama Tarchin had transformed the shrine, but before the retreat began, I saw this American monk doing his raking his leaves, as kind of a mindfulness practice. But he was kind of wandering over, I could see purposely, towards the shrine. So this shrine, this zendo, where he had spent so much time just meditating with bare walls, tatami mats, just complete simplicity. He looks in and, here's Vajrayogini with a pig coming out of the side of her head and dancing on a corpse and holding a skull cup full of blood. And he's like looking at all this stuff. And me having, practiced Zen Buddhism for, a little time, kind of knew what was going through his mind. So I went over, I was going to talk to him. And finally, I got very close. He saw me, he heard me approach, and he turned around and he said, "This is really weird." There was another former Zen practitioner there who was actually just about to marry Lama Dechen Wangmo. It was this Canadian woman who was installed, Lama Tarchin installed as a Lama. She's a wonderful teacher, now resides in Hawaii. She's back in the States now, I'm corrected, but nonetheless, wonderful Dechen Wangmo. She's wonderful. And but John Reynolds was this practitioner who they were, together and about to get married. And John had also practiced Zen. We found out later that the other people were calling him and me the Zen retreads. And that's how I feel. Nonetheless, I came across something I thought might be of interest. This book written by the Christian apologist, really, and journalist and novelist G.K. Chesterton about 100 years ago. This is just after World War I. He's referring to, I'm sure some of you know, in Wessex, the old western part of England, there are these carvings on some of the hills, and there's one particularly famous one. They're 3,000 years old. And basically, the people carved off all the dirt, the soil, and either it's a chalk mountain, so it's chalk underneath, or else they filled it up with chalk. I don't know. But at any rate, it's this. You should really look it up. Look up the White Horses of Wessex, something like that. I mean, it looks like something in that Picasso might have drawn. Totally modern lines, but there's this giant horse. It's like the size of a football field. It's 100 yards, so 300 feet long, but on the hillside. But this giant white horse on the hillside that these people created 3,000 years ago. And this is what Chesterton is referring to in this little story that I'm going to read to you. He starts out by saying there are two ways of getting home, and one of them is to stay there. The other is to walk around the whole world till we come back to the same place. He also says, like every other book I never wrote, it's by far the best book I have ever written. Anyway, he says, I conceive of this book that he was going to write as a romance of those vast valleys with sloping sides, like those along which the ancient white horses of Wessex are scrawled along the flanks of the hills. My story would be of concern some boy whose farm or cottage stood on such a slope, and who went on his travels to find something, such as the effigy and grave of some giant. And when he was far enough from home, he looked back and saw that his own farm and kitchen garden, shining flat on the hillside like the colors and quarterings of a shield, were but parts of some such gigantic figure on which he had always lived, but which was too large and too close to be seen. That, I think, is a true picture of the progress of any really independent intelligence today. And that would be the point of my book. I think there's so much wisdom in that. Too large and too close to be seen. I remember I grew up in my parents' household. My father was in the Marine Corps in the South Pacific in World War II. Saw some really heavy things, earned a Purple Heart, interesting man. His father had moved from England and became an American citizen around the time of World War I. Had been actually an interpreter from French to English for the English Army. But at any rate, so my father's family was Methodist when they were in England, and then came here to the States and became Episcopalian, which is like Anglican in England. So that's kind of funny because I think it was an attempt to sort of increase their status, because the upper class certainly is Anglican traditionally in England. At any rate, so my father's Episcopalian, right? Then he was guarding the first radar complex in Quonset, Rhode Island, Quonset Point. I can't remember the name of the town. And the Department of Defense, or the War Department, then put on a mixer, so the soldiers could have like some social life, and various people came, local people came, including my mother. And so he met my mother at this military mixer. And her family was Roman Catholic. They had come down from Quebec during the Depression, working on lace mills. Very working class family. I just always loved her family. They were just really, really characters. Several of my uncles, for instance, were quahog fishermen. Quahogs are these clams, and they go out in boats, and they have these giant rakes that go down, and very tough work, and they pick it. Anyway, quahog farmers, quahog fishermen. And the U.S. government came along, it's like in the 50s, and said, this part of the water is kind of polluted, so we're not gonna cohog there anymore, or the numbers were down. I can't remember what it was. I think it was something wrong with it. The numbers were good, but at any rate, you're not supposed to go there anymore. But of course, my uncle would go there. He was called what was called a quahog pirate because it was easier fishing. This is what I come from. So nonetheless, so here's my mother, Roman Catholic, very traditional. She lived in the French Quarter, if you can imagine this, of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, where the priest gave a homily every Sunday in French. She spoke French until she was 13, although she was living in America. All right, so she becomes Anglican. So anyway, we had this family of Anglicans, sort of. This is what I grew up with. And my father was a businessman, very wonderful man, very honest. But he was like, one of the trustees of the church. And he was also a local politician. So he would linger after the services on Sundays to be in the social, in the coffee, drinking the coffee and donuts and talking. And I would always be like bored. So I would just stay in the empty church. And I could feel something in that church, when it was empty, when all the people were gone. This is why I need the Mahayana. But nonetheless, my father had a book. It was written by a British Anglican bishop. I think James Robinson, I think was his name. And it was, Your God is Too Small. And it struck me very much. Your God is too small. There's nothing wrong, sort of, with our beliefs or whatever, but we're just too limited. Chesterton's tale here makes me think of that. He says there's nothing here. What was it he said right at the end? He said, that I think is a true picture of the progress of any really independent intelligence today. Independent intelligence, not in some partisan way that you're trying to force others to get to. I mean, it's tremendous courage to sort of look at your own identity in this way, the teachings on emptiness. So your God is too small. We had a woman she's now moved to Louisiana, who Roman Catholic, and she would come to the old Amitabha Foundation. And she told me, this is like 2 popes ago now, just to place it in time for you. She said, I'm a good Catholic. I really believe that the Pope is doing the right thing and the right thing for us. I believe everything that Jesus said. But she said, why I come here is because, when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, she says, I believe that. But why I come here is because the Buddhists seem to have the methods by which that can be done. So it's all about practice. And it struck me. I mean, it just struck me when I was reading Chesterton. I can feel kind of a rapport there. For one reason, I just feel that the Dharmic teachings are, as Kanze said, the least not wrong. There's a humility with that. When we read about the Buddha hesitating to teach after his great enlightenment, how rare is that in human history? He saw how easily things are, like you said, perverted for fame and gain, because we're still there. We're still in that. So it's like, you talk to someone and someone says to you, you don't seem, good grief, it doesn't seem like Buddhism has changed you at all. And, I said, well, you should have seen me 20 years ago. Even for me, with this kind of doubting mind that led me to do this kind of intense kind of reading and study and trying to, a doubting mind, but not a skeptical mind. Because for all of us, you can't be here without actually having true nature having manifested in a way. And again, that's the positive. It's not a negativity of everything gone, but that nothingness, so to speak, is with a capital N, and it has quality. It's so perfect when the Dalai Lama says, Dharmakaya is like the space sky, but it's nothing you can say. It's vast. It's in the smallest molecule. It's in the greatest universe. Everything. It's limitless, but it has this beautiful color, this blue sky. It's not just a non-entity. So when I think, when you think about different traditions in that, and you can see the benefit in all of them, really. But it occurred to me reading Chesterton yesterday, even this teaching of why Jesus came, saves us from our sins. This sense that human beings have that something is wrong. And so in this, I think, cruder way, okay, that made the whole world complete. These are the teachings of enlightenment. Here we are. We feel this kind of dissatisfaction. That's where his teaching started, the Buddha, this first noble truth, one of dissatisfaction, off center, just never. In fact, Garbage even says, this is, I think, verse 9 in our, I think it's verse 9, let's see. Yeah, verse 9, aspiring for liberation. So this is from the 37 Bodhisattva practices, slightly different translation, like a dewdrop on the tip of a blade of grass. Happiness in the three realms perishes for an instant, in an instant. Striving for the highest state of liberation, which never changes, is the practice of the Bodhisattvas. And Garamche says, the happiness of gods and humans in the three realms, the happiness of the three higher states of existence, is actually the suffering of change. This is understandable for everyone. Our lifespan does not last long, if we consider it. What we perceive as happiness during this time is not constant. Initially, everything seems so fine in youth, but even young people face many sufferings. To put it bluntly, samsara is characterized by suffering. In contrast, the stage of Buddhahood is referred to as unchanging happiness. From where does this kind of happiness come? To gain understanding, we contemplate the fundamental nature of the mind. It is free from suffering. By continuously observing it, it becomes clear that the nature of the mind never arises or ceases. Through this, we understand great happiness. Happiness of the Buddhas is the happiness of the fundamental nature of the mind. It is the unchanging happiness that delights everyone. With the realization that the Buddha nature neither arises nor ceases, we perceive the sufferings in samsara as dreamlike. Unchanging happiness arises within us. Furthermore, it is important that we do not accumulate karma and that we free ourselves from afflictions, for we create our suffering through karma and afflictions. Once we have overcome afflictions, there's nothing more to fear. So I think, just how incredibly fortunate. You think of the Buddha coming to his realization and then Buddhism flourishing and expanding for 1,500 years in India. And so this incredible range of teachings and methods and so then comes to Tibet. And happily, it comes with this comprehensive way. I mean, the Tibetan emperor said, we're going to transmit the whole range of this. And at that peak, because Buddhism declined thereafter in India. So the timing of it is so fortuitous. And in my own life, I think in such a small individual way, how fortuitous for all of us that at this moment that Tibet actually has traditionally trained, realized teachers, it comes to our country. It's just too rare to believe in. But the framework, so to speak, that came from India to the Tibetans, the Tibetans presented to the Tibetan people, so you could sort of get a hand on all of this, is so helpful. Just this basic structure of renunciation, compassion, limitless compassion, wisdom. it shows you, you know, the path. And this is so important for us. It said that one of Buddha's monks way back when was, you know, really frustrated. He just felt like he was getting nowhere. Um, and the Buddha knew of this and had him come to see him. And the Buddha took up a silk scarf and tied a knot. And then he tied a knot on top of that and a knot on top of that. I think if I remember correctly, he tied 8 knots. I can't remember. But nonetheless, he gave the knotted up silk scarf to the monk and said, how do you do that? How do you undo that? Do you just start pulling at it because you strongly want it to go away? He said, no, no, no. He just makes it tighter. Right. What do you do? Well, you have to undo the outer knot, then the next one, then the next one. And this is the genius of the gradual path that Tibet adopted in this formal debate and meeting between a Chinese master, an Indian master, and the emperor of Tibet so many years ago. You know, Gretchen and Joellen and Jerry, Gretchen's brother and wife, we went to that very spot. More than you can say, you know. So anyway, why? Because you see, people want wisdom, obviously. They obviously want compassion. But how do you get there? The renunciation. No one's doing the renunciation. We want to just jump to these things without any kind of sacrifice, really. Garon Pache says somewhere, you know, yeah, there's a little suffering with Dharma, but compared to the suffering of lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, nothing. This is good. So we have this laid out for us, and therefore we can investigate it. You know, where the doubts come up, that's the path, no problem. But you investigate those doubts. Instead of attaching to the doubt like some sort of gem that I've discovered that no one else has, you keep the mind open. Because truly, you can't even come across the Buddha's path without something very positive having moved already in one's consciousness. And that won't go away, no matter how much you try to deny or whatever. It's like Patrul Rinpoche says, you know, this precious human life, this life that has the characteristics, that the opportunities that a Buddha has existed, it has appeared historically, that a Buddha has actually taught. Not all Buddhas teach, that the Buddha's teachings actually remain. You can look, no matter how bad you're doing, you can look at these different 18 different factors and say, oh, I got that, but I'm miserable, but I got that, I got that. So there's this spark of happiness there, no matter what we do. So Patrul Rinpoche said the precious human life is like throwing a handful of barley on the side of a barn. How many grains stick? That's how rare it is. And that we have that, and that not only has the Dharma been taught in our era, but we've got, you know, masters. And it doesn't go away, you know, it cycles no matter what happens to Tibet. This very, very sad situation where they're taking, you know, especially nomad children, but all sorts of Tibetan children, putting them in boarding schools, which makes some sense if you're trying to educate a population and you've got a widely, you know, dispersed population, so much geography, it's the size of Western Europe. But of course, they're teaching the children in Chinese, not Tibetan. It's the biggest genocide going on in the world. Of course, no one talks about it. At any rate, different matter. But I'm saying even if Tibet were to go away, they have transmitted the Dharma pure here. And although it can seem like a little shoot, it's still a green shoot that's alive. And we have the ability, because we have Buddha nature, to make that sprout, grow, flower, and produce grain. Okay, I think that's enough of me this morning. All right. First, any questions? Otherwise, we'll take a break. Kempo is still, is he in TMC right now, Gretch? Yeah, he's still down at the Tibetan Meditation Center with his teacher, and is coming back, I think, the first week in March. So he'll be back. And Anything right now from anyone? Otherwise, we'll take our break and have a little coffee and tea. Okay. We'll ring the bell when it's time. Thanks.